Hello, my name is Geoff Carter. I'm an archaeologist who spent over 30 years studying the evidence for archaeological buildings and structures. This is primarily the study of post holes, mostly from unstratified rural sites, which, in my experience, can be the most complex of all archaeological data sets. Despite post holes being the most commonly found archaeological features, they are not studied, even at postgraduate levels at British universities. Failure to understand the built environments on so many important sites has contributed to the rise of alternative approaches, creating a simplified visual past, where imaginary people interact with imaginary landscape, all this in the imagination of an academic. By contrast, theoretical structural archaeology is an evidence-based approach, which reverse engineers buildings and structures using data modelling to explore the development of the technology of built environments. You can find details on my Theoretical Structural Archaeology blog. The subject of this video is Hadrian's Wall. Hopefully what post holes have to do with the wall will become apparent later. It is based on a talk I was giving last year to tourists walking the wall, when they broke their journey at the excellent Twice Brewed Inn. The wall attracts visitors from all over the world, so the first part of the talk is an ever-expanding section that explains the geography of northern England as well as who the Romans were and what they might be doing here. The talk is very specifically aimed at explaining Hadrian's attempt to build a wall, and as such is a 16-year snapshot of a structure that was active for over 280 years. As this talk normally takes place in a pub, I will continue the informal introduction while people are organising their drinks, dogs and the last vestiges of their bar snacks by asking if anyone has heard about Men with Hammers. Men with Hammers is a story you can start with Henry VIII seeking a divorce from Catherine of Aragon in the 1530s, or with Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Battle of Culloden on the 16th of April 1746, the last battle on British soil, which marks the formal end to the fighting in the Catholic versus Protestant wars that seem to dominate the British history syllabus. The previous year, Bonnie Prince Charlie, or Charles Edward Stuart, had invaded England with an army from Scotland, getting as far as Derby before losing his nerve and turning back. The story, as it affects Hadrian's Wall, is that the troops loyal to King George, based in Newcastle under General Wade, were unable to get across the country to prevent the Scots besieging and capturing Carlisle because of the lack of a suitable road. In response, a new road was built along the course of Hadrian's Wall by the simple expedient of smashing all the available stone into progressively finer layers using hammers. Thus the military road was created, which now provides access for the scant remains the road builders left behind. Perhaps only 10% of the wall now survives in some consolidated form, some of this work being done by Italian prisoners of war. There is a popular myth that the military road is the work of General Wade, who did build some important roads. However, he died in 1748, and the road was proposed by some enterprising local landowners, and its fate was sealed by an Act of Parliament in May 1751. By 1757 it was all over. Hadrian's Wall had been systematically destroyed for the cost of only £22,680, remarkable value, and only £230 over budget. Everyone was pleased. This was half the cost of a first-rate ship of the line at the time. Now everyone is sitting comfortably and contemplating the fact that what they have come so far to see is now a layer of hardcore, protected in perpetuity by successive layers of tarmac. I can start with part 1 of 3, Mystery What Mystery. Once you realise that most of Hadrian's Wall was destroyed over 250 years ago, why such a vast structure might be a bit of a puzzle, albeit with most of the pieces missing and no picture on the box, becomes a bit more apparent. By way of introduction, I will attempt to give a snapshot of the Roman Empire at the time of Hadrian and the background to the relationships between Britain and the Romans. Any one of these topics I'm going to breeze through could be the subject of a separate video. So before we go any further, let's talk about subtext or even meta-narrative. There is no secret or hidden subtext. I'm going to tell you up front what it is. It is how words and pictures condition our view of the past. This is an historical period, and the background information, although limited, was generally known long before the advent of archaeology. As a result, the physical remains have traditionally been approached from the perspective of an existing historical narrative. Archaeologists have the advantage of being able to understand evidence that is not in text form, before it becomes written down so that other academics could understand it. This is the key process of archaeology. This is what an archaeologist does: converts soil, or dirt as our American cousins call it, into words. Everything else is just academic, or copying stuff out in your best handwriting. One of the reasons that archaeology is not a science is that experiments are not repeatable. A proper excavation will result in the complete destruction of the evidence. What is studied is not the wall itself, but the written accounts of these excavations dating back to the Victorian period, which together form the peer-reviewed literature from which the narrative is constructed. There is a deep structural problem with this form of study. Universities insist that archaeology be taught by academics, not by archaeologists. Many people are thus taught archaeology out of a book by academics who learnt it out of a book. So you have little choice but to practice out of a book, i.e. only find and recognise and report those things that the book tells you should be there. What you learn at university is how to be a lecturer, not how to be an archaeologist. Thus, confirmation bias is not only built in at source, but has become an essential part of the methodology. Visual images are important to us. Even though we are aware they are imaginary, it is our imagination, and we are comfortable with it. Many of us have an image of Jesus that looks more like a Swedish tennis player than someone from the Middle East. But don't ask people to change their pictures. It makes you uncomfortable. From the quaint anachronisms of medieval stained glass to Hollywood blockbusters, our culture has sought to visualize the past. As an archaeologist, the one thing I am usually certain of is that I don't know what things look like. However, there is an expectation that archaeologists will produce a visual representation of what they have found. The money shot at the end of the popular Channel 4 programme Time Team is usually an artistic reconstruction. I don't want to dwell on this point, but all the pictures you have of the wall are imaginary. There is another problem with the Romans. So much our culture is derived from the Roman period that it is hard to see the joins. The remarkable persistence of Latin, still in use as a social marker to indicate an expensive education, and still referenced by British politicians where no other evidence of actual intelligence is present. Classical architectural forms are the go-to language to express power and stability, and even Roman political symbols have been reused with little regard to context in the modern world. By and large, civilization tends to be judged by the cultural achievements of their richest members, rather than by the methods they used to achieve this. In short, the Romans are viewed in a fairly positive light, representing power, achievement, as well as military and technical prowess. So this, then, is the author's message: how archaeology falls victim to its own words and pictures, neither of which archaeologists actually find. Just to be certain, then, once again, all images of the Roman wall, however realistic, are imaginary. Until 10,000 years ago, northern England was covered by an ice sheet that ground the landscape down to the bedrock. As the ice melted, it left behind a layer of boulder clay, or till, which is a random mixture of ground-up rocks or clay, boulders, stones, sand, gravel. The meltwater cut deep ravines into the landscape known locally as deans or burns, now occupied by comparatively small streams. The meltwater also helped deposit large amounts of sand and gravels in the major river valleys, materials which could prove useful to wall and road builders. The natural post-glacial vegetation is woodland, initially probably birch, but later probably dominated by sessile oak. This was partially cleared by agriculturalists and maintained as pasture by grazing or arable land by tillage. It's also worth noting that traditionally the 2nd century, when the wall was built, was considered part of the Roman warm period, when climate conditions were more benign than in later periods. The wall was built across the narrowest part of the country, measuring 67 miles as the Google flies. The wall is measured at 73.5 miles, so in reality it follows a remarkably straight course, with only perhaps 10% or so of squiggle. The valleys of the River Tyne, Irthing, and Lower Eden form a natural communication corridor at this point. However, more importantly, there was an existing frontier here in the form of a road known as the Staingate, which linked a series of forts. The wall seems to have been built along a line north of this road that took advantage of the spectacular natural escarpment of the Windsill. So perhaps now is a good time to talk about the geology of the area. The rocks marked in red are volcanic in nature, a large sheet of dolerite, which is quite literally the hardest rock in Britain, so as the ice sheets ground away the softer sedimentary Carboniferous rocks, the windsill, as it is known, was left as a prominent escarpment. About 2/3 of the wall is built across Carboniferous deposits, laid down in shallow seas and swamps over 300 million years ago. This produces successive cycles of limestone, shale and sandstone, as well as coal deposits. However, in the west, the rocks are younger and deposited in the drier Triassic period, which produced distinctive red wind-blown sandstones and no limestone, which is needed when you make mortar. While the local geology makes the enterprise possible, it was the Roman army that provided the technical know-how. A mortared masonry wall was new technology. There is no reason why the natives would have known which rocks to burn, and the ability to create mortar and stick stones together is probably another example of a secret Roman military technology. We know the army was involved in the building because they left inscribed stone to celebrate their achievements. The extent to which civilians and slaves were involved at the initial stage is unknown. Later in the life of the wall, inscriptions from civilian workers from southern England are found. It's also worth noting that mules are a very effective way for moving stones and other materials. Unlike wheeled vehicles, they do not require proper roads. The wall is a simple construction with a mortared core filling the space between a facing of shaped blocks. The structure sits on a slightly wider foundation in a shallow trench. There are reports of puddled clay being used for bonding, which seems impractical, and I can find no scientific evidence of this. The basic components are sandstone, which is widely available, and limestone, which is burnt using firewood or coal. The resultant lime is mixed with water and aggregate to produce the mortar. The idea of building a stone wall was a new and expensive solution, which would take several years to achieve. What you get for your denarius was a permanent structure, which would serve as a barrier to horses and wheeled vehicles. However, anyone with a ladder can probably cross the wall on a dark night. So let's talk about the Romans, or at least in very general terms. Roman society was dominated by a group of hereditary land-owning aristocrats. Roughly 600 of these men formed the Senate, the principal ruling body of Roman society. The Republic was devised to ensure that while the Senate retained real power, no individual could become too powerful. So, for example, there were 2 heads of state, known as consuls, who were elected annually. However, it was those members of aristocratic families who did not inherit the title, as it were, that did the bulk of the heavy lifting in the empire. They were known as equites, quite literally knights. The plebeians were formerly the peasantry, who ploughed the fields and scattered for the aristocracy, but with urbanization in empire, many of these plebeians were engaged in business, and thus one of the forces that drives the empire was not only the need for food to feed its urban centres, but also the need for manpower to work the agricultural estates. At the time of Hadrian, the conquered peoples of the empire formed a lower class below proper Roman citizens, though above the status of slaves. Like the Greeks, they regarded non-Romans as barbarians. As might be expected, in a system set up specifically to prevent any one aristocrat gaining too much power, they ended up with an emperor. Although by the time of Hadrian, this was an accepted constitutional office, coexisting with traditional institutions. One of the most important aspects of the Roman system is that it provided lots of paid jobs running the state and empire. The strength of the system was that, according to status, there was a possibility of a wide-ranging structured career in all aspects of the empire. As a result, by the time a Roman aristocrat became a senator, he had already had a wide range of experience and had his character tested in a variety of circumstances. This was an important factor in maintaining the empire. It was to some extent a meritocracy that rewarded participation, and a bit like the way we used to think of national service, it gave the Roman citizens a shared experience. The Roman class system was rigidly enforced in the structure of the army. The emperor was the commander-in-chief. The troops in the provinces would be under the command of a governor, a person of consular rank. For Roman legions, the commander, and senior officers, known as tribunes, would usually be of senatorial rank, while the rest of the officer corps would be equites. The citizens formed the famous Roman legions. Non-Romans, citizens of the empire, formed the auxiliary units, though this gradually became more confused over time. Now, I want to introduce you to Aureus Nepos, one of the most interesting characters in the story of the war. This reconstruction is from a statue base put up in his honour by the citizens of Aquia, which is a town in Italy sort of fairly near Venice, where he was patron. It is quite literally his curriculum vitae, expressed in letters after his name. Now, Nepos was appointed governor of Britain by Hadrian and was responsible for the building of the wall. His most important job, however, was consul, and he was actually co-consul briefly with Hadrian. Below this is listed his governorship of Britain, the last official post that he held. What's interesting is to see that his first job, probably in his late teens, was a supervisor of public executions. After this, he did a political job as tribune of the plebs, which I think is where Hadrian started his career, slightly higher up the ladder. After this, he held his first military post as tribune of the 22nd Legion, a post also held by Hadrian, so they may have known each other in that context. He also seems to have been a supervisor of roads north of Rome, and it appears that he was chosen by the Emperor Trajan to build a brand new road from the Red Sea up into Syria. It is this experience of supervising engineering projects for Trajan that made him the obvious choice to supervise the building of the wall. The rest of his career was not untypical, being a quaestor, legionary commander, and provincial governor. It is thought he came to Britain bringing in extra troops in the form of the 6th Legion in 122, the same year that Hadrian visited. Around the time Nepos was arriving in Britain, a cavalry officer named Eumelus was leaving Britain and returning to his native Pannonia after 25 years of service. We know this because we have his bronze official diploma thanking him for his service and granting him and his descendants Roman citizenship in perpetuity. However, what's really interesting about these legal documents that while they are issued to specific individuals, they often list all units currently serving in that province. As a result, this document issued in 122 lists all the units serving in the British garrison, and it is from these diplomas and the other inscriptions that we're able to build up a picture of how the Roman army was structured and distributed. The older parts of the empire were literally ungarrisoned and mainly the concern of the Senate. Most of the legions and supporting units were arranged around the frontiers. Hadrian's decision to build a wall was in keeping with his policy of consolidating rather than expanding the empire, as his predecessor had done. Trajan had fought a successful and profitable war against the Dacians, but came a cropper when he tried waging war against the Parthians. Unsuccessful military adventures in Iraq, a familiar story. This is why Nepos was building Trajan a road, probably using prisoners captured in the war against Dacia. As a result of these campaigns, the eastern part of the empire was somewhat unstable during Hadrian's reign. The sharp-eyed will have spotted that Britain has the largest garrison of any province, with roughly 13% of the entire army. 80 years after the conquest, this relatively unimportant province had a garrison of 3 legions and up to 50 auxiliary units. Turning to a timeline of Roman Britain, it starts with the punitive raids on southern England by Julius Caesar in the 50s BC. But it was only much later, in 43 AD, that Britain is subject to a full-scale invasion under the Emperor Claudius, which secured the south. Why it took such a long time to get round to invading is an interesting question, and the simplest answer is the English Channel. It's thought several expeditions were planned, but for various reasons fell through. Caesar's action in attacking Britain and in agreeing terms and tributes ensured an ongoing relationships. Perhaps more significant is the taking of hostages. These would be normally members of the ruling families, young aristocrats who could be brought up in a Roman household, taught the Roman way, and returned to their society with something like equite status. The Roman sandal was very much in the door, even without military intervention. Besides, they now controlled access to continental trade and social networks. that helped define what being an aristocrat in Britain was about. There is evidence of diplomatic contact and elements in southern England doing their best to ape aspects of Roman culture. Frankly, we're not an issue important enough to have bothered Roman historians, and much of this has to be informed by archaeological finds. No account of the Romans would be complete without a mention of Julius Caesar, who interacts with our narrative in several ways. It is his invasion and war in Gaul that brings Britain into Rome's sphere of influence. Secondly, he writes a book about it, providing an extraordinary insight into how warfare and politics works. He also gives a brief account of the cultures he was in the process of destroying. Of particular interest in Caesar's writings are his descriptions of military operations, in particular the use of engineering. It was one of the most unique aspects of the Roman army in the field. They could build forts and camps as well as siege works, using engineering in both defensive and offensive situations. Their artillery, some of it armour-piercing, outranges any other weapon of the time, and completely changes the long-accepted norms of ballistics on the battlefield. The Roman army's ability to build bridges allowed Caesar to launch unprecedented shock-and-awe raids across the Rhine. All this structural engineering was accomplished using timber. The world described by Caesar is basically a brutal international protection racket. At one end of the scale, the Romans could cultivate friendly relations using gifts and trade. Some groups in Western Europe refused point blank to have anything to do with the Romans, perceiving this as the thin end of the wedge. Other groups formed treaties with the Romans to protect themselves against their neighbours. In return, the Romans might expect troops, tributes or supplies, and hostages to seal the deal. All of this short of all-out war. War itself yielded the immediate benefits of plunder and slaves. The big advantage of fighting with your neighbours is that you can break them militarily and impose terms. Being a client state, where the existing aristocracy are allowed to carry on running the state, Roman assistance was a halfway house to being a full province. Thus, King Herod was ruler of Israel, quite an important successful figure in many ways, but lower in social status to Pontius Pilate, who would have been a Roman senator. The Romans expected to have a fight. It was the honourable thing to do, and the only way to resolve the issues. However, break the terms of an agreement and all bets are off, and the Romans, a minority in their own empire, would stop at nothing to prove a point. By the 1st century AD, the Romans had conquered a vast empire, so they knew with absolute certainty that the gods and right was on their side. Just to make the point, the Roman historian Plutarch tells us that Caesar's campaigns killed 1 million and captured another. They were not here to sell us plumbing. To put that in perspective, the French army lost 1.3 million in the First World War. 1 million slaves are worth an extraordinary amount of money in the Roman economy, and we're not counting women and children, who are actually probably in many cases worth more than the hulking front row forwards of Northern Europe. In destroying Celtic culture, invading Britain, and writing a top-selling Latin textbooks were not enough, Julius Caesar went on to break the Republic, leading to civil war, Pompey, Antony, Cleopatra, an asp, and ultimately infamy, they've all got it, infamy. It was left to his heir Augustus, nay Octavian, to sort out the mess. He managed to reconcile the idea of a republic with that of an emperor for life. There had always been a provision for a dictator in the time of military threat, a specialist third consul, and ultimately Augustus found a constitutional model allowing the emperor, among other things, to serve as commander-in-chief and also as spiritual head of the empire. What was never really sorted out was succession. The meritocratic approach was lost as the office was passed through a series of progressively less effective family members. Claudius, famously made emperor by elements of the army, was disabled and had been excluded from the normal political career expected of a Roman noble. This may have been a factor in his launching an invasion of Britain, giving him some sort of credibility as an emperor. However, it should be noted that his predecessor Caligula had reportedly made an unsuccessful attempt, which may indicate that some of the necessary logistical preparation work had already been done. so there was, for example, sufficient naval resources to undertake such a venture in force. If we fast forward 70 or 80 years, we get to Hadrian. He was known as one of the 5 good emperors, which out of 80 is rather a poor strike rate. What particularly distinguished these emperors was the orderly transfer of power, with a minimum of aristocratic bloodletting, to candidates chosen by and large on merit. So it's important to make the point that in the 2nd century we're not dealing with mad relatives of a decadent imperial family, but constitutional figures. They are mindful of their place in history. If they play their cards right, they will be made a god after their death. Well, if their fellow senators vote for it. The opposite was in Damno Memoriae, where you were quite literally erased from history. In reality this was quite rare, not a precedent emperors wished to establish, but for some emperors like Caligula it was a close-run thing. Hadrian followed Trajan with only a few deaths among his rivals. You will note that on this coin of Hadrian, Aug refers to Augustus, referring back to the powers he established, but he is equally keen to point out that he's been cos 3, i.e. he's been a consul 3 times, including while also being emperor. PP is a title he accepts in 128, Father of the Nation, and this title on coins and inscriptions is often about as close as it gets for dating. It is thought that Hadrian visited Britain in 122, setting up his court in London, while he went on a tour of inspection. We know he built the wall because of inscriptions and a reference in his biography. It's also worth noting that in terms of official history, this is all we've got. Frankly, the authors are more interested in some scandal involving the empress and goings-on in the court, while Hadrian is away up north. So what about Hadrian himself? Well, this is not something that regular archaeologists are really qualified to comment on. Luckily, there are specialist types of archaeologists who devote themselves specifically to written artefacts known as historians, and they have quite a lot to say about Hadrian. He's an interesting character, but rather contrary. He would probably insist that Shakespeare was overrated and that Christopher Marlowe was much better. He certainly didn't like Homer for some reason. He's a bit of an imperial jack of all trades. Which he was master of is more problematic. He was undoubtedly effective master of the Roman world, so there were few prepared to contradict him. Hadrian seems to have been suspicious of people with real talent, and had an unrealistic opinion of his own. His biographers are keen to tell us the story of Apollodorus, an important architect in Trajan's court, who, when approached by a young Hadrian with drawings of his own, seeking an opinion, was somewhat forthright and critical of the young man's abilities. To be fair, neither party knew that Hadrian would become emperor, and Apollodorus had effectively signed his own death warrant, because it is reported that when he became emperor, he sought grounds to have Apollodorus killed. As a military commander, he had had 3 stints as a legionary tribune, and had been involved in some of his predecessors' campaign, so he knew his stuff, and was a very hands-on commander-in-chief. He was nosy and knew how it all worked, and he knew what questions to ask. Returning to the timeline for Roman Britain, successive Roman governors had subjugated the island. Gradually they were working their way north and west, and under the Emperor Domitian, a governor known as Agricola was responsible for overrunning northern England, thought to have been dominated at the time by a group known as the Brigantes. It's worth noting that he starts in North Wales, where the Romans were, 17 years earlier, fighting when Boudicca rebelled. The governorship of Agricola is a sudden ray of light on affairs on the island. Historian Tacitus was his son-in-law, and he wrote a biography which gives us quite a detailed picture of these 6 years of campaigning. It all culminates in the Battle of Mons Gropius in 84, where, having defeated all the other groups, the Romans find themselves confronted by a reported force of 30,000 enemy combatants. The scale is important. The people of the Highlands and Islands, in numerical terms, outnumber the Roman legions, if not the army itself. However, the Romans had provoked them into open battle by marching on the grain production areas. It's worth briefly describing this battle, as it's a good example of how battles were fought in this period. The 2 armies faced each other across a valley, with the Caledonians arrayed on a mountainside, with a mass of infantry in the centre and cavalry on the wings. The Romans did the same, with the auxiliary infantry at the front and the legions arranged behind. The Caledonians used chariots to harass the Roman line, a tactic that had survived in the island, but little used elsewhere in Europe. The Roman army were not intimidated, and advanced in formation, driving the chariots back into their own lines, and taking advantage of the chaos to drive into the Caledonian centre. At which point the cavalry and infantry came streaming down the hill to attack the flanks of this Roman formation. The Roman cavalry then counterattacked, driving off the enemy cavalry, at which point the enemy formation began to break up. Warfare in this period is brutally simple. If the infantry can maintain its cohesion and discipline and stay in a tightly packed defensive group, it's reasonably safe. But the moment you turn your back and start to retreat or run away, you have lost and run the risk of being cut down by the cavalry or the pursuing infantry. Reportedly, a third of the Caledonians were killed. That's 10,000 men. The rest escaped into the wood. The Romans lost a few hundred. The lesson for the Caledonians is that fighting the Romans in pitched battle was not going to work. They simply had not the tactics or command and control to execute them. In many respects, the Roman army had been developed to counter traditional Celtic battle techniques several centuries earlier. However, the Romans were reluctant to pursue their quarry. They had inflicted heavy casualties and presumably taken control of their grain supply. But the highlands and islands were mountainous, wooded, and had lakes, creating confined spaces not good for heavy infantry. Ideal ambush country. Control of the highlands would require significant naval capacity, particularly in the west. In the east, they had raided as far as the Orkneys, which would have been a nasty surprise for them. In the event, the Romans initially opted for containment, building a timber legionary base at Inchtoutel and a series of watchtowers and fortlets. However, Agricola was recalled, and the Emperor Domitian seems to have lost interest, abandoning Scotland and the new forts, withdrawing troops from the garrison, presumably to fight a war in Dacia, a more immediate threat and rewarding prospect. Thus, Tacitus' remark about conquering the whole island and letting it go. So this was a strategic situation inherited by Hadrian. 3 army legions, with the 6th replacing the 9th in York, which infamously disappeared from our records in this period. A quick word about Roman army structure. Each legion had 10 cohorts composed of 6 centuries. There is a remarkably common myth that the century was composed of 80 men, not 100 in each unit. The solution is 2 out of each unit were probably specialists, support troops, experienced administrators, armourers, surgeons, and didn't fight in the front line. They stayed with the baggage and the collective kit of the unit, such as their 8-man leather tent and the pack animals necessary to carry it. Equally strange ideas have been circulated about the composition, particularly accommodation of cavalry units on the wall. Just as we saw in the battle, it was the auxiliary troops that were to man the front line, in this case the wall, with the legions held in reserve much further south, occupying their traditional bases of strategic importance. The extensive military infrastructure and logistical network is largely manned by auxiliary troops. As far as we can tell, there were concentrations of cavalry on the flanks as well as probably in the centre of the line. If the intention was to stop any incursion at the wall, sufficient warning is required to move legionary resources up to the wall, so it stands to reason that the territory north of the wall must be acting as a buffer zone, protecting direct assault on the wall, otherwise it simply wouldn't work. A point well worth making is the importance of a specialist navy on both coasts, both to supply the frontier and simply protect it from being bypassed or outflanked by enemy naval forces. Those from the highlands and islands would be perfectly capable of using boats. As we have noted, cutting off the isthmus with a physical barrier is effective against cavalry and any force with baggage. It also suggests that the previous and more traditional approach of a line of forts linked by a road had failed at some point to such an extent that it had prompted this radical solution. Moving on to wall scholarship, I'm going to point out 8 key concepts in wall scholarship, which represent the general consensus about Hadrian's Wall. This is the basis of what you are sold as a student by universities and as tourists if you buy the more expensive guidebooks. First point. Hadrian's Wall was built by the Roman army between 122 and 128, according to our friends at English Heritage. Second point. It was built from east to west with specialist gangs working on the complex structures which were then joined up with lengths of wall. The defensive structure consisted of an outer ditch with an area of obstacles between the wall and the ditch. The wall was built with a fortified gateway every mile with 2 intervening turrets. Initially the wall was built with a 10-foot thick gauge known as the broad wall. Subsequently, in the central sector, it becomes less thick at 8 foot, known as narrow wall. However, in the western third of the wall, it is built from turfs. At some point during the construction, up to 14 forts are added. At some point, a large earthwork comprising banks and a ditch forming the southern boundary and known as the vallum was added. The first 3 items are largely descriptive, but items 4 to 8 are the essential mystery. What is going on with the project that prompted all these changes in plan? Traditionally, these are known as decisions, as in the Broad Wall decision or the Vallum decision, implying a proactive process, perhaps the result of a fickle emperor changing his mind. More recently, David Breeze has suggested that these changes in the plan are the result of warfare. Known as dislocations, they are more reactive than proactive. This then is the mystery of Hadrian's Wall. What do all the apparent changes represent? What on earth was going on? Because any idea that Hadrian's army simply turned up and built a wall from sea to shining sea is far from the truth. The archaeological evidence tells us a very different and much darker story, which we will continue in part 2. Thank you very much for watching, and look out for part 2, Building the Myth.